This is a presentation from the Wapaka Historical Society.
Okay, welcome everyone. I've been a Mason for 35 years. This is my 35th year, which seems like a long time. But Charles Larson, who sponsored this program, has been a Mason for 70 years this year. So there are some that are a lot longer. I'd like to start out with a definition of what Masonry is. If I'm trying to give you a definition, it's not an easy thing to really define. It's a fraternal organization that's based on making good men better, is what was told to me when I first came into Masonry. A person has to be 18 years of age to be a Mason, and they have to have a belief in a supreme being. This means that you can be of any religion as long as you have a belief in a supreme being. And so Masonry is not a religion. We promote friendship, morality, and charity work. Before, I would say, the 1980s, it was kind of a unique thing. A Mason could not ask another person to become, if they wanted to become a Mason. Some families, the father wouldn't ask his son if he wanted to become a Mason. You were supposed to inquire yourself into it, and then they could talk about it. But now, that has changed since we're looking for members, actually. And so now that's changed, and you can ask people if they would like to be a Mason. When a person wants to be a Mason, the lodge meets with him and forms a committee to meet with this person. And then the Grand Lodge does a background check, and then the person is voted on, the candidate is voted on at a regular lodge meeting to become a Mason. And he has to get a clear ballot from every person in that room. And if someone has something against them or whatever, or knows something and votes against them, they have to give a good reason why. But most of the time there is no problem. And if approved, person goes through, there's 3 degrees: the entered apprentice, fellowcraft, and master mason degree. The degrees are obligations and morality plays based on the Old Testament. And after you go through the degree, there is some memorization to do. It used to be that you had to memorize the entire degree, but now there's just a few questions and things you have to memorize, so they've made it a lot easier. And when I came in, I got to memorize the whole degree. Paul Bammel was the person who mentored me. And you really get to know a person when you meet with them and you try and memorize quite a large amount of text, and you keep going over it. And so that was really interesting. And we have books, ciphers, that help with the memorization, where they have 1 letter, 2 letters. It's called a daggett, and this is one of them. And so because none of the degree is supposed to be written out. It's supposed to be done from memory from one Mason to another, but for years now people have used the cipher to help them to memorize. And there's no high, the lodge here in Wapaka is called the Blue Lodge. And the Master Mason degree, when you get your Master Mason degree, that's the highest degree you can get in Masonry. And you have to be a Master Mason in order to join things like the Scottish or York Rite or the Shriners. Every Shriner is a Master Mason. And Masonry has been, I don't know, for years talked about as maybe a secret society or something, but there are no secrets really in Masonry anymore, because the obligation was the secret part of Masonry, and that's all online. Anybody can look it up, and so really there are no secrets in Masonry. I've got a couple of quotes here of people telling what they think Masonry is. And this was in 1887. The Grand Master Eugene Elliott told the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin, "The teachings of our craft constitute a code of morality as perfect as can be devised by the wisdom of man. We know that while in no sense a substitute for, it is the faithful ally of true religion, and we know that under its influence all that is good, all that is true, all that is beautiful in our manhood is elevated and perfected." And 100 years later, George Wallinger, Grand Master of Masons in Wisconsin, 1986, defined the nature and purpose of Masonry. "Freemasonry is an organization of men dedicated to improving themselves and the world in which all of us live. To accomplish this noble goal, the organization places primary importance upon recognizing a creator, God who is Father of all things in the universe, and that true happiness can best be achieved if men strive to live and work together as brothers. By admitting the supremacy of the Creator, we admit that there are laws which are natural and must be observed. We call this morality and require the study and education of a correct moral system. We use symbols, rituals, and traditions to pass the learning of our generation on to another, refining and perfecting the process and the lore as we progress in time. In the course of promoting the brotherhood of man, we break down the barriers that separate them. It makes no difference what greatness a man has achieved, nor how he has failed. It matters not what church he attends or what creed he professes, nor if he has none of the other than a sincere belief in God as Father of humanity. It matters not his or his ancestors, country, or race. He is a brother if he abides by our simple and virtuous precepts and puts them into action in his daily activities. We agree that true happiness and harmony with God, nature, and ourselves can best be achieved if we do this in concert as a fraternal group." And in 1984, the United Grand Lodge of England Board of General Purposes issued a statement. "Freemasonry is one of the world's oldest secular fraternity societies, a society of men concerned with spiritual values. Its members are taught its precepts by a series of ritual dramas which follow ancient forms and use stonemason customs and tools as allegorical guides. The essential qualifications for admission and continuing membership is a belief in a supreme being. Membership is open to men of any race or religion who can fulfill this essential qualification and are of good repute. Freemasonry is not a religion, nor is it a substitute for religion. Its essential qualification opens it to men of many religions and expects them to continue to follow their own faith. It does not allow religion to be discussed at any meeting. A Freemason is encouraged to do his duty first to God, by whatever name he is known, through his faith and religious practices, and then without detriment to his family and those dependent on him, to his neighbor through charity and service." The Masonic Lodge. The history of the Masonic Lodge, well, we trace the ancient history back to King Solomon's Temple, where there were operative masons. Workmen were designated by their skills. They were entered apprentices, who were the workmen, fellow crafts, who were the overseers of the work, and master masons, who were the designers. The stonemasons of the Middle Ages used the same designations and worked on cathedrals and public buildings in the Gothic style. They were known as Freemasons because they had passes to travel from city to city when most of the population at that time were indentured to the land. These masons, especially the master masons, had knowledge of geometry. Modern Masonry traces its beginnings to June 24, 1717 in London, England, when a Grand Lodge was formed at the Goose and Gridiron Ale House in St. Paul's courtyard. Men outside the field of stone masons were allowed to join the fraternity. This is when the term free and accepted masons came into use, as masons were no longer just operative masons, but speculative masons, which mean they used Masonic symbols as allegorical symbols and were not actually building things with stone. This Constitution of Free and Accepted Masons was written by Dr. James Anderson in 1723 and published in 1724 by Benjamin Franklin. Grand Lodge of England and Grand Lodge of Scotland are ancestors of the U.S. lodges and Wisconsin lodges. Masonry came to Wisconsin from Virginia and North Carolina. It spread from Virginia to Kentucky and then to Illinois, from North Carolina to Tennessee to Missouri. The first Masonic lodge in Wisconsin was at Fort Howard Military Camp, which is now Green Bay, in 1820. And it was called a Menominee Lodge. In 1821, a lodge was formed in Platteville, Melody Lodge, with the miners who worked there. Lodges grew in the southern section of the state, and on December 18, 1843, at a meeting in Madison, Melody Lodge and Milwaukee Lodges met to form the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin. Presently, Wisconsin has 183 lodges with a membership of 14,000. Membership in the U.S. is 2 million. And it's kind of interesting, Alaska has the most Masons. The Masonic home in Dousman, which is called the Three Pillars home, is a nursing home that we support. There are 6 million Masons nationwide or worldwide, 200,000 Masons in England and Wales, and 33,000 lodges worldwide. But Masonry, the membership in Masonry in the last 20 years has dropped some by 150,000. Early Masons in Wisconsin were Henry Dodge, who Andrew Jackson appointed as territorial governor and superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1836, and James Doty, founder of Madison, succeeding Dodge as territorial governor in 1841 and was a U.S. congressman. The Wapaka Lodge first met at the Gothic Hall in Waupaca. Okay, in 1859, 11 Masons residing in the Waupaca area enlisted as charter members petitioned the Grand Master of Masons in Wisconsin for dispensation to form a Masonic lodge. The dispensation being granted, the 11 Masons assembled on the 13th day of March in 1860 and organized the present Waupaca Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons and elected their officers. 7 of the brethren present contributed 25 cents each to defray the expense of the meeting. Brother Joel Newell of Berlin attended this meeting and was the lodge's first instructor. At the Grand Lodge session of June 12, 1860, a charter was granted to the Waupaca Lodge, and on the 25th day of July, 1860, the Grand Lodge, with M.L. Young presiding as acting Grand Master, held a special communication in Waupaca and formally instituted Waupaca Lodge number 123 F&AM. The first regular officers elected included all the officers who acted upon the dispensation, plus Edward L. Brown, who was appointed senior deacon, and Erastus E. Blinn, who was appointed junior deacon. Our lodge held its first meeting at the Gothic Hall which was on the corner of Union Street and Jefferson Street, and continued meeting there until moving into its own building, our present location, which was purchased on May 12, 1864. At the first meeting of the Lodge, May 13, 1860, 6 petitions were received for membership by the degrees. On April 3rd, the Lodge conferred its first degree on EA upon Edward L. Brown, an attorney, and Thomas A. Brown, all of whom at later dates became members of the Lodge. On April 11, 1860, the Lodge conferred its first Master Mason degree upon the above-mentioned Edward L. Brown, who thereby became the first brother to be made a Master Mason in the Waupaca Lodge. At this time, a new altar Bible was purchased for $2.25. And April 27th, M.L. Young, who was the original authority of our Wisconsin ritual, met with the Lodge and spent 4 days instructing the officers and members. On May 29th, the Fellowcraft degree was conferred in our Lodge by Grand Master Gabriel Buick. On January 1st, 1861, the Lodge room was destroyed by fire, and no meetings of the Lodge were held until April 23rd, at which time the first financial report of the Lodge was present, showing an indebtedness of $8.26. On May 13th, 1861, Myron Reed, Grand Master of Masons in Wisconsin during the years 1888 and 1889, was raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason and became a member of Waupaca Lodge 123. Several years later, on September 8, 1863, Henry R. Denny received his Master Mason degree in our Lodge. This brother became the Grand Master of Masons in Minnesota for the year 1884. This gives Waupaca Lodge the distinction of producing 2 Grand Masters of 2 different jurisdictions, namely Wisconsin and Minnesota. The site of our present Lodge, and probably go to the next one, was purchased May 12, 1864, which means the Waupaca Lodge has been in the same location for 158 years. To defray the cost, an assessment of $5 was made upon each member. This was regarded as a loan and credited to the members' respective dues accounts, and was offset in the years that followed. The first trustees of the Lodge were elected about that same time. There were 5 in number: Edward E. Brown, Henry J. Stetson, David Scott, Evan Townsend, and Myron Reed. At a meeting of September 11, 1866, a resolution was passed that each and every member furnish the Lodge with a framed portrait of himself at his own expense. On May 28, 1868, several Wisconsin Masons attended the ceremony of the laying of the cornerstone at the post office in the city of Madison. A meeting of the Wisconsin Waupaca Masons for the purpose of organizing a chapter Royal Arch Mason was held June 22, 1868. This was the start of the present Waupaca chapter number 39 of the Royal Arch Masons. On August 22, 1871, the sum of $75 was voted for the fire sufferers of Chicago and those of the northeast part of Wisconsin, Peshtigo. Also $25 toward the purpose of the fire engine for the city of Waupaca. On March 9, 1875, the amount of $25 was voted for the grasshopper sufferers of Kansas, and on March 22nd, additional $10 made available to them. On February 19, 1877, fire destroyed the Waupaca Masonic Temple. As a fraternal courtesy, the Oddfellows offered the use of their lodge rooms, which was gratefully accepted. As a result of the fire, the speculative Masons became operative Masons and immediately began rebuilding the temple. On December 21, 1877, the rebuilt temple was dedicated. Loans were again solicited from the members not to exceed $10 per member. As before, these loans were credited to their respective dues accounts and offset in the years that followed. In addition to the loan, Brother Andrew J. Van Epps made a present to the Lodge of all the Masonic jewels. On September 26, 1881, the Lodge voted to have spread on its minutes a resolution of condolence over the death of President J. A. Garfield. A copy of said resolution was mailed to the family. Electricity was installed in the building on September of 1891 as a gift from the Waupaca Chapter number 39 Royal Arch Masons. A charity ball for the relief of the Hurley sufferers was held in the lodge on December 12, 1893. A funeral benefit of $50 was instituted in 1886. On October 13, 1894, the lodge voted to discontinue the payment. The picture that hangs in the lodge today of George Washington was presented to the lodge October 26, 1897 by Mrs. J. H. Calkins. On April 26, 1898, a dispensation was received from the Grand Lodge to permit a chapter of the Order of Eastern Star to meet at the Wapaka Lodge rooms. The Wapaka Masons went all out to please and impress these ladies. The building was redecorated and new carpeting, furniture, drapes, curtains, and dining room necessities were purchased. On May 2, 1899, the first social with the ladies was held with great success. City water was next installed in the building. In December of 1899, a piano was purchased for $298, with the Star paying one half thereof. The death of President William McKinley caused the altar and charter to be draped for the usual period of mourning. Church was attended for the first time by a lodge as a body on June 10, 1902. Unfortunately, this worthy practice had not been continued throughout the years. In 1902, the building was extended to provide more room, with an estimated cost thereof of $300. Also during this period, the building was connected with the city sewer. In December 1903, hot water heat was installed at a cost of $1,000, and in March of 1905, telephone was added for the convenience of the members. The 50th anniversary was celebrated on the March 22nd, 1910. The committee of this event was composed of Brother George H. James, George Gotcha, Frank A. Lear, Daniel F. Burnham, Fred L. Parrish. This featured a banquet and program by past Grandmaster Nathan Griffin. On November 28, 1911, the Lodge voted $50 a relief of the Black River Falls Lodge Brethren. On October 27th, the Lodge had its first game supper. This event became an annual fair and now is our annual homecoming and turkey dinner. The ladies' influence may be perceived in a resolution passed on June 24, 1919. Thereafter, no cuspidors were allowed in the lodge rooms, reception rooms, preparation rooms, nor the Tyler's place. Okay. They put in a Carey oil burner in 1929. And so the lodge has quite a history here of giving and of rebuilding and keeping the lodge up. Our membership in the lodge was in 1959 was 214. The all-time high membership was 128, with a total of 257. In 1937, they had the count was 174. Right now we have about 45 members, but we have 5 candidates to go through the degrees, so the things are looking up a little bit for the lodge. As you look at the building, Tracy did some research on Stratton's Drug down below the Masonic Hall. The Masonic block, the 2-story brick building, is Italianate detail. It features at present metal cornices decorated with dentils and brackets. Under the cornice is brick corbelling that suggests brackets. In the center of the brick cornice is the Masonic symbol and the date 1877. Stone label molding decorates the second-story openings, which are partially enclosed with wood and single light sashes, and the storefront was modernized. In 1877, when the Masonic Lodge was built, Rant Bailey Pharmacy was in the lower level. In 1884, C.A. Spencer took over the pharmacy. In 1914, C.H. Truesdale relocates the pharmacy from First National Bank building on South Main Street to the Masonic block. And in 1915, Frank Stratton takes ownership of the pharmacy. He had just, at that time, he had just the right side of the building, and the left side was, in 1974, Rob's Bakery. And in 1976, Richard de Turville and Richard Kempfert purchased Rob's Bakery and expanded next door the two buildings. And Richard Kempfert took over sole ownership of Stratton's in 1985. So since 1877, as long as the lodge has been there, there has been a pharmacy underneath the lodge, which is kind of interesting. Okay, you go to the next one. Here I took some pictures quickly of the interior of the lodge. Most of you probably haven't seen it, but this is our lodge room. We redid it, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago? 5 years, 6 years? Something like that.
It started in 2013.
Okay, so almost 8 years ago. And repainted it and fixed it up and took the carpeting off the floor, and we found the beautiful wood floors underneath, so we've refinished them. So this is our lodge room. You can go to the next one. It's another look at it from the other side, looking west. And then we have, this is our banquet room, I guess you'd call. We have the pool table and the billiard table, and then so this is where we have eat our meals. Another shot of it. And this is we have pictures of all the worshipful masters of the lodge, all the years it's been there, up on the wall, and in our entry room. Okay. That's the other side of the entry room. And then this is our kitchen. We have a nice stove, a nice oven, nice setup for the kitchen. Yeah, that's the other side. Have dishwasher, which is important. Okay, these are some of the early Masons. The first master, worshipful master, was Dr. Linus Bidwell Brainerd. From 1805, he was born, to 1885. He was assistant surgeon for the 7th Infantry in the Civil War, 1862. Go to the next one. This is Samuel A. Tinkham. He was promoted. He was in the Civil War. He was a master of the lodge before he went into battle, and he was promoted for bravery at the Battle of Shiloh, where he died. He received a battlefield promotion because his commanders, his superiors, he was just a sergeant, and his lieutenant and captain both deserted, and he took over the infantry there and fought bravely until his death there. Okay, the next one. Myron Reed. He was a law partner with M.S. Sessions He was the second mayor of Waupaca. He was a Wisconsin senator, and he became Grand Master of Masons in Wisconsin. The next one, Edward L. Brown, famous lawyer from Waupaca, whose law office is across from Bank First, the oldest continuous law office in the state of Wisconsin. Okay, next one, Henry Stetson. I don't have anything on him. The next one, Evan Coolidge. He was county treasurer and was a Wisconsin assemblyman. The next one, John M. Ware. Anybody who knows anything about looking around for history of Waupaca County knows that the Ware books, the two volume Ware books, are the go-to for it was edited by him in 1917. So anybody who was here before that time of importance had their biography in his book. Next one, Andrew J. Van Epps. He was a Civil War veteran and the mayor of Waupaca. Next one, this is James B. Simcox. He was a hardware merchant and son of a Methodist minister. Okay, Dave Parrish. Next one, George Nordvie. He owned a shoe store in Waupaca. Next, and this fellow here. This is my grandfather. He was master in 1903 and 04, and he was he made 3 centennial. He was a Mason for many years and a staunch Mason. He was a Mason. My father was a Mason. My stepfather was a Mason, and my mother was an Eastern Star. Okay, the next one, Truman Potts. I don't know, many of you know him maybe. Yeah, Helen Robinson's father. Next one, George Hendrickson, superintendent of schools in Waupaca. Next one, Reuben Danielson, president of the Farmer State Bank for years. Next one, oh, there's Tom Godfrey. Brian's in the back. Implement dealer in Waupaca. Roman Danielson, a guidance counselor in Waupaca. Otto Warsbach. His son has been real important with the depot. Larry Woody, he worked. Ran Madison's Silo here in Waupaca. Next one, C. Kenneth Peterson, realtor in Waupaca. Okay, and Tom Holly's funeral home. Paul Bammel's furniture store in Waupaca, if you remember that, and Bammel's funeral home. Jerry Telfer, he was a lineman for the Wisconsin Public Service for many years. Lauren Kelly, barber in Waupaca for many years. Charlie Larson, who helped sponsor this program, a teacher, agricultural teacher in Waupaca. Don Badgley, who Badgley Leisure Center in Waupaca, and is now at the Three Pillars home in Dousman. And this guy, I don't know. It was kind of interesting. The second time I was Master of the Lodge was 2004, which was 100 years after my grandfather was Master of the Lodge. Okay.
Picture's older than that.
Yeah, well, no. Jeez.
It's older than the second.
Yeah, right. Okay, now I'd like to show a DVD. It's Lee Sherman Dreyfus talking about the history of the Masonic movement in this country and how it helped to form the United States as you see it today. So I hope you enjoy this. I think he does a very good job. Thank you.
If ever a time that the tenets of this fraternity have been needed in history, it's got to be today. Because I'm watching this world divide out into camps. Camps divided by religion, camps divided by ethnic base. And this is the place. One of the references made here by Brother Fleming, when he said, if you are a Christian Mason, you should come into York Rite. And those of you who are visiting now tonight and wonder about this fraternity, the fact that he said Christian Mason is because there are all kinds of Masons who are other religions. My brother Neil, during World War II in Karachi, which was then part of India, was in a lodge in which the holy book that was on that altar was a Quran. And at this point, I think is when the world probably needs this. You hear references, and I really want to talk tonight to those of you who are not members of this fraternity. You'll hear references to things like a trestle board, and if you don't know what that is, the trestle board is the architect's board in which he lays out the work for the day that the workmen are to carry out. And anybody who's been in the construction business knows what a trestle board is and the modern version of it. But the idea of having you men in here who are friends and not members of the craft, that's something very new. Because the old system, and by old I mean literally for centuries, right up until the most recent decade, the old century was that you never asked anyone to join. Now can you imagine a fraternity that bases itself but never asks anyone to join? It's only when they ask to join, so they've come of their own free will. And we finally set that aside. But even under that never asking, it rose to over 5 million Americans who wound up in this fraternity. Also, it was a secret society. It obviously isn't today, but it was, and for very good reason in ancient times. And it also is of an oral tradition, and was mentioned here that they are plays. And that's right. Understand, most of the, if you just go back a couple of hundred years, most of the Masons in any lodge could not read or write. Illiteracy was standard. The royalty who ran countries could not generally read or write. It was very unusual. And as such, everything was taught by means of the play, or taught orally, and you had to memorize. And that's why you have those traditions that grew up and stayed with this fraternal organization. Now, why was it secret? I mean, my best determination, at least from my background as a former professor, as far as I can see, the ancient base of the Masonic degree, Master Mason, was in a sense an engineering degree. So that you were either an apprentice or a journeyman or a master. And that's still true in the AFL and the trades today. We still use those designations. But you see, you didn't have the ability to chase credential. So when somebody's traveling in a foreign land and they step in and say, I'm a fellow craft or I'm a master mason, well, they need to get some proof before you let him take over charge of building either a particular arch over a doorway or a part of a building. And that's why they had these secret do-guards and signs and secret words, and could sit down with them and decide, had they really learned those lessons? Were they really given to them? And that's the reason it was passed on, and I really think it was a form of credential that allowed people of the trades, particularly when cathedrals were being built all over Europe, it gave them the ability to travel and be able to prove that they were what they said they were. Because if you don't have your credential, you're dead in the water. And even in modern times that's true if you can't come up with it. But that was the basis of it, and I think that's the reason for all of these old techniques. Now the question is, why don't we get rid of them? Because I think there is a value in history and historical repetition. There was for me. Mike mentioned that I was raised in 1950. And when I first started, one of my degrees, I can't remember which one, was on February 22nd, Washington's birthday. But it was so important to me as a young history scholar that I realized I was now going through exactly the same process as was gone through by George Washington himself at one point when he was raised and eventually became a Master Mason before our American Revolution. And that was important to me to know that I was walking the exact same steps and using approximately the same wording and getting the same kind of learning and teaching as the founding father of our country. Now, the actual stonemasons, as were mentioned here, these are the people who built all those cathedrals prior to 1700. And they weren't built at one time. If you go to Westminster Abbey, they'll show you the oldest part, 1069, and then every century or so things got added. The same thing is true if you get to the cathedrals in any part of the world, you'll find out when these things were done. But think of all the craftsmen who created that work and their ability, and that they had formed this kind of union, if you will, a kind of guild and a kind of fraternal organization, but all of them were operative, actual stone masons, people who could take stone, shape it properly, and put it in and make it work, and structurally and architecturally it was proper. Now, what happened is, from 1700, we see the end of that period in history, and quite frankly, there are no more great cathedrals being built. Men who were Freemasons, I'll tell you what they were. That meant that they were not tied by indenture or any other thing to some bishop or some cardinal or some prince or some king. They were free. They were free to offer their services to whoever was doing building. And you see, as the cathedrals start reducing in number, these people have got to get on the move to go chasing jobs in order to get employment at the level that they want to be paid, and those were the highest paid craftsmen of the time. They were the Freemasons. And as these lodges began to shrink, it was then that they finally decided, with a decline in the number of craftsmen, and young men were not coming in, and that's when they decided to take in and accept some men of goodwill, and particularly men of status and stature, including the royalty, the people who were in Parliament, for example, in Britain, and elsewhere on the European continent. And that's why today you have the term free and accepted Masons. Originally, the accepted Masons were people like myself. I wouldn't know what to do with a stone and a chisel and a piece of stone if my life depended upon it. But I have been then an accepted Mason as opposed to one who is genuinely an actual operative Freemason. Now, the free and accepted now are the builders of a different kind of temple, and that's been made reference to. We're not talking about building physical buildings anymore. We're talking about this temple that I'm standing in right here now in front of you, and the one that you're sitting in as you sit out there in front of me. And that's not a new metaphor, that notion that this is the image of God, and it is how we use it, how we share, how we give, how we love one another. It is what is within us, and there are times when we get an opportunity. And when I think of all those children that the Shrine Hospitals help, that's an act of God, in my opinion. When I think of what's happening now with dyslexic youngsters and what Scottish Rite is doing there, including right in this building with one learning center and another in Madison, and there are now rapidly being built all over the country. We're going to solve dyslexia. If the Masons take it on, it's going to get solved. Just as we are now beginning to run out of crippled and burned children. If you got to have a problem, isn't that a marvelous problem to have? That we are no longer, and we have to import them from other countries because we've taken care of the problem here. What a marvelous thing for this fraternity to be able to do. And it used to do that without ever telling anyone. Well, on that basis, we became a social society, and all the stonemasons' tools, whether it has to do with living by the square or on a level, you all know what a level is, well, you live on the level. All masons are on the level when they're in a lodge. Maybe not quite all. My brother Woods was in a Masonic club in the Philippines, and after the island was fairly secure, they had a visit from Brother Douglas MacArthur. And he gave them all a speech with his 5 stars up here on the collar about how in this lodge there is no rank and there are no titles. We are all brothers on the level. But my brother said nobody really went up and said, "Doug, old boy, how are you?" and put it on. It is true that we do live by the square, and the square is a major tool of the stonemason. We live on the level, we hope. And we know that on that trestle board is the work that's cut out for us for whatever years we've got left ahead of us. And in fact, when it comes to the issue of deity, as was mentioned here earlier, we don't use the term God or Allah or any of those, Jehovah. We use the term, again, a Masonic term from the craft, the supreme architect of the universe. Do you realize that's totally encompassing? So that there is no religious requirement in this fraternity except one. You cannot be an atheist. And the logic of that is that if you take an oath to whoever your God is, in whatever form you hold God and your beliefs, if you have no such belief that there's any power beyond you in the world, then your oath is no good. You can change it tomorrow. That was the basis of it. And it makes good logical sense to me. But as I look what's happening now with Muslims and Christians and Jews at each other's throat and about to engage, I think, in a major problem and battle coming up. If there was ever a time that that whole concept of tolerance and diversity, and this nation embodies that concept more than any other nation on the face of the earth. Now, where did this nation get it? I'll tell you flat out, there's no question in my mind, it came out of this fraternity, because you cannot separate the history of America from the history of Freemasonry in America. They are one and the same, and let me just point that out to you. And by the way, it happens internationally. There have been 6, in my opinion, 6 great true revolutions in the 17th and 18th century. What do I mean by a great and true revolution? A revolution that was not aimed at taking power. It was a revolution aimed at giving power to the people. And there were only 6 of those. One was obviously here in America. One was in France. One was in Italy. One was in Hungary. One was in South America. And one was in Mexico. Now, who were the leaders of those 6 great revolutions that brought power to the common people? Obviously, George Washington in this one. And in France, it was Danton. In Italy, it was Garibaldi. And in South America, it was Simón Bolívar. Mexico, Benito Juarez, and in Hungary, Kossuth. All of those men, Freemasons, all of them. Is that just chance? Is that just the luck of the dice? I don't think so. In fact, I'm wondering if all of our history could even be looked on as chance or luck. I look at, we had a Scottish Rite dedication in this very hall. I remember sitting back up there in the balcony, and I was sitting with Tom Ament, who was then our county executive before he got pensioned off pretty well. And but sitting up here, where these men are sitting, was the head of the Prince Hall Lodge, the black Masonic lodges, was the head of the Grand Lodge here of Masons in Wisconsin. The Lord's Prayer was sung by the cantor from Temple Emmanuel, and the prayer, opening invocation, was done by the dean of the Roman Catholic Cathedral over here. And I looked at all of that, and I said to Tom, I said, do you realize what you're looking at could not have occurred even in this city just 20 years ago? That you see this gathering of people of different faiths, different religions, different races and ethnicities, and yet they're able to gather on a common basis. That's a historic event. You and I take those things for granted. I'll tell you the rest of the world doesn't, but they're starting to pay attention. When you had the great head of our military, Powell, now Secretary of State, when he was in command of the most powerful military force on the face of the earth, as a general, and he turned over the baton of power to George Shalikashvili, the next chief of staff. You paid no attention to that at all, but do you think the rest of the world didn't notice that it was a black man passing the power peacefully to a man who had a Georgian, German, Polish accent named Shalikashvili? That can only happen here, but it's got to begin to happen elsewhere and throughout the world. In fact, the problems that we're seeing now, especially the so-called anti-Americanism, and much of it being fomented, but it's for good reason. America is no longer a place. In my opinion, America has become an idea, and the idea came from the craft of Freemasonry. And that idea is what's moving across the face of the globe, and if you're in power, those ideas are dangerous. And I can understand the Middle Eastern people, the ideas that are being presented in this country, saying, look what happens when you let the common people move and control the government. They don't want any part of that, because then they have to give up the levers of power. And this is going to take a struggle. There is no question about it. But it's starting to move worldwide, and something that happened here. When I look at the key question for me, is this all chance, or was it written on the trestle board? Did the Supreme Architect lay out the plans for the building, first of all, of this country to become the tool to bring freedom, tolerance, and love, and peaceful connection to the rest of the world? History documents, frankly, are limited in this fraternity, because, as I said, it was all by oral tradition. We don't have many of the things that we wish we had in writing. The minute people are oral, then you lose out. And we're going back to that really in an indirect way through the internet. That's all going to get lost. Although don't count on it if the IRS is investigating. No, we've had that. Andrew Jackson, also a member of this fraternity and craft. But Andrew Jackson, true to his Masonic tradition, was very oral. He didn't write things down. And we don't have a lot of things from the Jackson administration. No question for most historians and historical scholars that Jackson sent all those Tennesseans to Texas to get that revolution started. He wanted to get Texas into the Union, but he couldn't do that without getting into a war with Mexico, France, and with Austria. But by sending down the governor of Tennessee, a man named Sam Houston, and sending down the congressman from Tennessee, a man named Davy Crockett, and by sending down Jim Bowie and Travis and all those other names connected with the Alamo, and sent them down there to get that revolution started, because he knew if Texas could free itself from the Mexican control, then it could be annexed and it could come into the United States and become a state, and that was his goal. No question about it. We pay a price for not having written documents, but there was also a great advantage. You see, no man is supposed to be quoted outside of a lodge. And in fact, that was very important in the American Revolution, because the British, who have always had kind of a separatist notion about themselves, carried their own Masonic lodges with every British regiment here in the colonies, and very seldom visited colonial lodges. What that allowed is for those brothers to get in and argue the issue of whether we ought or ought not continue to support the king, or we ought to become our own free nation. Those discussions could be hammered out within a lodge, knowing they weren't going to be quoted outside afterwards. We're fully aware that the Boston Tea Party followed a Masonic Lodge meeting. And the idea of getting dressed up in costumes to carry out something is not new to Freemasons. The common thread of the 13 colonies, and you need to understand that they had very little in common. And especially when you've got these southern colonies with a slave base for their power, and the northern colonies not only without a slave base, but anti-slavery as they grew, particularly under Puritan, Congregational, and the Presbyterian drive up north. But the one thing they had in common was the craft. All of those leaders, and I do mean all, were Freemasons. And they could share that, because you see, you don't know when you meet a Mason if he's a good man. I'll tell you that right now to our guests. You meet a Mason somewhere, a stranger, you don't know if he's a good man. But you do know that at one point in his life, a group of good men thought so. That you can be sure of. And that's what it means. And it's the one thing that is helpful, particularly if you get in strange areas and need help from a stranger. You'd be surprised the stories connected with that. But the revolution was in fact absolutely fomented within the lodges, colonial lodges. Now, when I was out in Concord and I see brother Paul Revere, who carried the message, as you well know, and the signal was from the sextant up in the Old North Church, and that had always bothered me as a historian. Why the Old North Church? I could understand the Old South. The Old South was a congregational church. And those were all the loud, big-mouthed, militant patriots, and there was no question they were not loyal to the crown. But Old North was an Anglican Episcopal church before you had the establishment of an Episcopal separate church. They were Anglicans. They were loyal to the crown, loyal to the king and to the Bishop of Canterbury. Why would the signal come from Old North? It's because the sextant was a member of the craft. And they knew that the British troops would not be watching the Tower of Old North. You can bet they were watching Old South all the time for any kind of a signal. But nobody was watching the Old North Tower as to whether the British were going to go by land or by sea. As you know, they chose land, and anybody who tries to bail out of Boston by land is doomed. The Declaration of Independence was not signed July 4th. I think most of you know that. Those men had to get out of there and get home safely, or they were going to be captured and tried. They all added their names much later. One name was signed on it, a brother named John Hancock. But that was because he was already under warrant. They already had a price on his head. And he knew when he came there that if he got caught, and the British didn't want to make a move on him while the session was involved with the Declaration, because there were too many other people there to help him and support him. But the rest of them took off, and then the document was sent around until they all signed on. But quite frankly, it was Brother Hancock whose name went on there first and began that declaration. Now, who carried out the war? George Washington, obviously, member of the fraternity. His aide, Brother Alexander Hamilton. His key generals, von Steuben, Wayne, Allen, Lafayette, even Casimir Pulaski, the young Polish count, and yes, Brother Benedict Arnold, I must admit. As I said, a group of men thought so, but at some point he turned. I just want you to know that Washington needed that thread because he knew that if he had his top generals and they were all fellow brother Masons, he could trust them, and he knew he had a tie to them, a cable tow to them, that was different from just commanding officer to the next level of rank. And the Constitutional Convention, after that successful war, when the Constitutional Convention was carried out, it almost failed. We almost didn't get that Constitution. And what saved it, and there's a dozen accounts that any of you can check that out, an 81-year-old Grand Master of the Lodge of Pennsylvania stood up and talked to them, and I'm talking about the great Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin saved that Constitutional Convention, and they finally all agreed that they would sign and worry about what we call the Bill of Rights at the first act of the next Congress, and they pledged those that were going to become congressmen that would be the Act 1 of Congressman 1, and it was, and they passed those first 10 amendments. Is that just chance? I don't think so. But that 81-year-old really did not want to be at that convention. He was really not very well, and he'd been spending a lot of time over in Europe. I look at Lincoln. I'm telling you, Abraham Lincoln, as a 2-year, one-term congressman, holding no other political office, lawyer from the backwoods of Illinois, out west, as it was called at the time, and frankly representing a brand new party created farther north up in Ripon, Wisconsin, just 6 years before. He didn't stand a snowball's chance in Hades of being elected the President of the United States. He was going up against a giant from Illinois itself, Stephen Douglas. He was going up against the Vice President of the United States, Mr. Breckinridge, and a man by the name of Bell. All three of them were powerhouses. And yet when the smoke cleared, out comes Lincoln holding the brass ring. Now why? First of all, he was the only one who understood that the key important issue of that era was to preserve this experiment, to preserve this union. If any one of the other three had been elected, there would not have been a civil war, as they call it, and frankly, we would have divided into two countries, and frankly, Europe would have been back here in force. But when I think of the moon landing, and I look at Armstrong and Aldrin, those two men, both of them, fellow Masons. I had a chance to sit with Neil Armstrong at the EAA and ask him, I said, those words are just incredible. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I said, did Chris Kraft, who was PR for NASA at the time, I said, did Chris Kraft put that together? It sounds like his work, because I think he's terrific. And Armstrong said, no, he didn't. And I don't know where it came from. That isn't what I was preparing to say. Chris Kraft had given me something to say, and it was very beautiful. But for whatever reason, I just blurted that out. I look at our atom bomb itself, and the decision to use it, and that was a member of the Kraft brother, Harry Truman, 33rd degree. But I look at the fact that this country created that. When you say to yourself, how come we got that bomb, and think of if anybody else had gotten it, would they have done with it what we did? Especially Germany, Japan, Italy, or the Soviet Union. Just think if they'd gotten that. Well, you say, well, those American scientists did that. Very important that we had all those brains over here. Robert Oppenheimer was the only one born here. Einstein was sold, fled Germany, and came here. Teller and Szilard out of Hungary, and Enrico Fermi out of Italy. They come here to the University of Chicago. Why Chicago? Because Chicago had been a member of the Big Ten, and they quit football in 1937 and 38. Oh, what's that got to do with anything? I'll tell you what it's got to do. It's got to do with the fact that when they got in here, they find that here's a university that has a big, hollow, cement horseshoe and nothing to do with it. They don't need it. And they built the world's first nuclear accelerator inside that Alonzo Stagg Stadium, smashed the atom, from there to Los Alamos, and you know the rest of that story. And I tell you what happened in 1945. The two bombs that we dropped, they were not the most important. I'm telling you, it's the third one that we never dropped until the following spring in Bikini. Never before in the history of the world did any nation ever have a sword that powerful and didn't use it to subject its neighbor to its will. And instead, this whole nation said to its government, you bring those boys home, you turn that bomb into a plowshare, and they did. And I submit to you, no other nation on earth would have done that. I look at World War II, and for those of you as our guests tonight, who are the names you associate with bringing about the successful conclusion of that war? You've got to start with Churchill and Roosevelt, no question about those two, and followed by Harry Truman, and certainly General Marshall and the Truman or Marshall Plan that followed after the war that preserved that peace. And you've got to look at Douglas MacArthur out in the Pacific and what he did in laying a constitution and creating a democracy in Japan from a nation that had been a warrior nation. Now, am I to tell you that most of those men are Masons? No. All of those men were Freemasons. Admiral King. I'm going to start going down the line. Admiral Leahy. I'll go down to Bull Halsey. But there's no sense in going down farther ranks in either theater. The five key men, all of them members of this craft. Is that just chance? Or did they carry with them those notions that they learned from the time that they entered as a entered apprentice? But I think this current century, the one that I'm going to miss, is very promising because there's a possibility of a quantum leap to build the world's royal arch. It'll cover all of the peoples, all of the religions, all of the races of this world to understand that we are all brothers and sisters and that we are under one fatherhood. It is possible a world of no war, of religious tolerance, of racial tolerance, with food, shelter, and security for everybody in the world, and a brotherhood of mankind. So for those of you now who are my brothers in this hall, I tell you, this is no time for any of you, regardless of your age, to say it is high 12 and there is no work before us. He has put a good deal of work on that trestle board. And let us get to our labors and finish building the temple. There's an incredible opportunity. Thank you for letting me talk to all of you.
Well, I thank you all for coming, and